Hey everybody. So I'm going to make a few comments on your interview papers, and I'm going to make these in a way that I hope are helpful for any writing that you might be doing in any class, and also for future messages that you're creating in this class. And I say messages because I mean things like the online difficult conversations project as well as future papers. So I'll jump right in. There were some really nice things about your interview papers, some things that I really liked across the board. I enjoyed reading these. I liked the selections that people made. I thought by and large people chose really interesting individuals to interview, from colleagues to parents to people running different parts of universities where you work, and married couples and so forth. So I was very pleased with that. And I was also pleased with the quotations from the interviews. People used a lot of nice messages from the individuals you interviewed, and I think that's great, and that's what we wanted in this assignment. So we hear their voice a little bit in the paper. I thought you did a nice job on the whole of reflecting on what you learned and exploring a little bit that interview process as well. And overall, I thought the connections to course material were good in most papers. And there were some challenges and struggles with that, but there were nice connections to materials by and large, really across the board. I want to spend most of my time here saying some things that I believe could improve the writing. I'm not talking about any one paper, and these observations may not apply to your paper at all, or one or two of them may apply, what have you. But I did want to make some observations across the board. The first thing, well, there's three opportunities that I saw for improvement. The first would be with introductions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The second would be with general organization of papers. On occasion there were some challenges with that, and then just a few APA things that a number of people struggled with. APA being the American Psychological Association guidelines for writing, as you know. So a few things. Topic number one for introductions. I really think with any paper, with any message, in this class or in any other class, and I talked about this in the video for this project, I think you want to have an engaging general introduction that in some way broadly introduces what you're going to do, that invites the reader into the paper. You don't want to start something like this necessarily with, I interviewed these individuals. Start the paper with an invitation in, with an introduction of some kind. And again, that was something I talked about in the video for this project. But I think sometimes, just in papers in general, people almost make them a little bit more like a report instead of a message that invites people in, that engages the reader right from the start. Here's just one example. This one I wrote, and I know it's a little long on the screen. This is one of any number of ways that you could have done an introduction. But you might say something like, let's face it, textbooks have their strengths and limitations. Our text in this class does a nice job of cleanly laying out terms and theories related to conflict management. Of course, in the real world, conflict does not always unfold like discussed in the textbook. To learn more about conflict management outside the pages of the book, I conducted interviews with two individuals with a great deal of real-world conflict experience. In the pages to follow, I will introduce these individuals and explore what they had to say about conflict management. Throughout this process, I will connect what my interviewees said about conflict with what we are learning from our course readings. Now again, this is just one example, and you never want somebody, you want your own voice, you want your own style. You could begin this with a quotation, you could begin it with a short story. You didn't have a lot of space in this paper for, certainly couldn't have a one-page introduction, but you could begin it in all kinds of ways with your own style and your own voice, but begin it in an invitation in. I think all of you have probably had courses in public speaking, and a paper should have an attention getter, just like a speech should have an attention getter. Here's an actual introduction from the class, and this was in someone's paper, and I asked if I could use it here. And you can see on November 26, 2011, NASA launched the Curiosity rover mission to the planet Mars. Its mission to discover a habitable zone on the red planet. And now, 18 months after its landing, Curiosity rover has at least at last looked back to the inhabited zone of all humanity and snapped her first image of all 7 billion Earthlings living on the home planet. The Curiosity rover tweeted 2 days ago, quote, "Look back and wonder. My first picture of Earth from the surface of Mars." I liked reading that as an intro because I kind of thought, why am I reading that? Where are we going? And then the person took it right to the paper. The above news story seemed a fitting metaphor for this particular assignment. The Curiosity's tweet and the accompanying story hit the virtual news outlets 2 days after my last interview and a week or so after delving into difficult conversations, and so forth. So a general introduction, really starting from a very creative point. I never would have expected that as a reader. A general introduction that comes usually a thesis, a preview. If you read down here, we get an idea of where this paper is going. It's a less deliberate thesis or specific thesis, if you will, than the one I had in the previous example, but it's fine. It's good. In fact, it's very good. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about today, was writing captivating introductions to your papers. And of course, when you do your difficult conversations online project, you want a captivating introduction there as well. You don't want to just start with, there are 3 conversations or something. Okay? Lots of good examples of introductions in the papers, but there were also a lot of individuals who sort of skipped the introduction in the papers. So I wanted to talk about that. The second thing I want to talk about is the longest topic here, and that is this issue of general organization within a paper. And there are a few things to say here. The first is that it is very often a good idea to have a preview statement in the introduction, and just however you word that. And this paper will explore, this paper will talk about, we'll explore in the pages to follow. I'll introduce you to the people I interviewed and explore how they connect, how their observations connect to our course readings. That's a preview statement that lets a reader know what the paper's about and where you're going. It's kind of a thesis and preview. Sometimes it's a good idea to have subheadings in a paper. You don't always have to have subheadings, but sometimes it's a good idea. And it is always a good idea to have transitions between ideas in the paper. It is always a good idea to have transitions between ideas in the paper. And I'll explain that a little bit as we go. So with general organization, most of the time you will offer a preview in your introduction, usually in the first paragraph of a paper. And I'm just repeating myself a little bit here, but in the pages to follow, we'll meet a couple of unique conflict guides, the people I interviewed, and explore the way their observations connect to our course or whatever. So a preview of thesis and preview. What's this paper about? Where are we going? Again, use your own voice. Lots of different ways to do it. But this is another thing I wanted to mention. And several people did this and it really worked well. But you may well want to offer what amounts to kind of an internal preview in a paper. You may well want to offer a preview of some connections that you're going to make in the paper. So most of you started the paper, you had an introduction or you moved to the interviews, and then you went to, okay, here's what I learned in the interviews. But in many cases, what started to happen was we got kind of a series of random paragraphs of observations from the individuals that you interviewed. And you want to structure that in some way for a reader. So this is almost a quote from somebody, but I used it. I wrote this. I didn't ask the person to use theirs, but the interviews produced a wide range of interesting insights on conflict. I find, that should just say, I find 5 of these particularly interesting. Face, interaction theory, conflict style, listening, and the need for learning in conflict. And so what I'm getting at here is this person, and excuse this find, should just be one. But what this approach does is sort of, let's say you're on page 2 of the paper, you kind of let the reader know what's coming. And you don't have to say the 5 things. Even just saying, now that we've met Jim and Samantha, let's explore the connections between their observations in the course. There were 5 that I found particularly interesting, and then you would go on. So a lot of different ways to do it, but some sort of an organizational structure or glue in the middle of the paper can be helpful as well. Again, a lot of times what I found happening and I see this in papers all the time, is it was kind of like another thing and another thing and another thing, but we want to weave them together. We want to hold them together in some way. A few more comments about general organization. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes in a paper it's good to have subheadings. And you should look at APA standards for subheadings, because you have to organize them in certain ways. But basically by subheadings, I just mean like big markers. They might be underlined in your paper. You might have a subheading that says the people I interviewed. Or you might get a little more creative and call them, my conflict guides. And if you had that subheading, you had my conflict guides, you would then introduce your two people. And then you might have another subheading like connections to course readings. Or you might get a little more creative and say, 5 aha moments. And then you would be writing about the 5 moments in these interviews that you really learned something. Like, wow, that's really interesting. That made me think in a different way or see something in a different way. So sometimes subheadings can be of value. I write with subheadings all the time, but you don't have to use them. But they do allow for a certain clean pattern of organization. I'm not going to go so far as to recommend them, but I think they often work well, especially if you struggle with organization in a paper. And speaking of organization, remember, you can organize this paper however you'd like. And I think sometimes, especially undergraduates, don't always realize how free you are to organize a paper. Yes, there has to be an organizational structure, but this paper could have been a story. You could have started with an introduction of you being nervous to interview people or whatever, and then kind of going in and exploring, and I walked into this door and here's what I found. I found these 3 connections. You could have organized the whole paper as a story. Or you could have organized the whole paper around like 5 quotations. So let's say you introduce the people and then you could have had like quotation 1 and the person's talking about something related to conflict, and then you analyze it. Passage 2, and you have a passage, and then you analyze it. And that would have worked well also. All you had to do was connect what you learned from these individuals with the course material. So I really encourage you to think in unique ways about organizing the paper as well. In this class, they didn't have to be a unique way, but there did have to be some connective material to organizing. Last couple comments here. We'll do the APA video separately. But general organization, remember that you want transitions between paragraphs and topics as well. This was meant to come down one after another, but they're all here, so we'll deal with them. All right, so suppose you're moving from a paragraph on listening to a paragraph on power. So you found 2 different observations in your interview, something about listening, something about power. You might say something like this, interestingly, there was a clear connection between listening and power. Diane explained that, Diane being the person that you interviewed. So you really want to have in your writing, almost always, there should be a link between one paragraph to the next. Occasionally there's no link, and that works because it's kind of cool, but usually there's a link, and you have to put it in your own voice and your own style, but usually there's a link. In fact, usually there's a reason why you're putting one topic after another topic. All right, so that was really important. That's something a lot of writers struggle with, I think. And then here's another example. Say you're moving from a definition to conflict style. So your person defined conflict, and then you're going to talk about conflict style. It might look something like this. With conflict defined as a fight over ideas, Diane and I then explored how she participates in this fight. Diane, excuse this too. I did this quickly, I must confess, because my children are home on another winter day, so they're not here right now. So I rushed this slide a little bit. Sorry about the couple of mistakes here. But anyway, Diane described her conflict style as, okay, let me see here. I'm not going to redo this at 14 minutes. Here's what we want. So if you're moving from definition to conflict style, again, 2 different paragraphs. With conflict defined as a fight over ideas, Diane and I then explored how she participates in this fight. Diane described her conflict style as blank, blank, blank. Well, she didn't say it. Her style is what McCorkle and Reese described as collaboration, comma, a style characterized as. Now, I'm doing a lot of things here, right? First of all, when I say with conflict defined as a fight over ideas, I am linking back to Diane's definition. Presumably, she had that in that last paragraph. And then I'm saying we move to how she participated in this fight with her conflict style. And using the word fight down here, again, is linking the two paragraphs. Diane described her conflict style as such and such. And then here comes the textbook. And so you're always trying to flow and trying to put those links in, those styles, almost like it's formal, but you're talking, if you will. Okay? So transitions between paragraphs and topics, you really want to continue working on. They should almost always exist. Sorry for the little bit of rambling there in that last passage, but hopefully that makes sense. All right. And just general organization, last two things, don't forget about a nice conclusion, although most of you did not forget about a nice conclusion. That's great. And every message should have a strong introduction, a really clearly organized body, and strong close. Every message. Your future projects in this class, any paper you write for this class, you want them to be an engaging invitation. You want them to feel like a paper, not so much like a report. Now, again, lots of good examples here, but in these papers, in this pile of papers that I read, virtual pile, but in many cases, these types of things could be helpful to all of us as writers, and we're all growing as writers, grad students, undergraduates, and myself. We are all growing and getting better as writers, kind of a lifelong process. So I'll go ahead and stop here. There'll be another shorter, much shorter video coming up with a couple of APA things with these papers.